All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started tonight. Welcome everyone to the Cumberland County Data Center Information Session. It's been a long time since we planned this in January with our initial date. There was a lot of interest and we had to reschedule to tonight. So it took a little while to get scheduled, but we're glad we're here tonight. We're glad that we have nearly 300 people registered for this. And the webinar will also be live streamed on YouTube and also saved for others to look at in the future. I'm Kirk Stoner. I'm the Director of Planning for Cumberland County. I'll be one of the moderators this evening. Along with us tonight is Janet Anderson. She's the Executive Director of the Cumberland Area Economic Development Corporation, or CADEC. She's also going to be co-moderating the session with me this evening. I wanted to recognize some of our program partners to start. First, the Cumberland County Board of Commissioners. We thank the commissioners for the investment they make in the planning department and the way they care about our residents and trying to get good information out to our residents to understand what's going on in the county. Clearly, this issue, in my opinion, is probably the hottest issue that the county has faced in quite some time. The Board of Commissioners is dedicated to making sure our residents have the right information. Likewise, our Cumberland County Planning Commission, we thank them for their support of looking forward, being proactive about the land use issues that are facing the county and trying to get in front of those issues. In particular, I'd like to thank Ed Franco, one of our County Planning Commission members who've really been instrumental in setting the panel up. Also, our Cumberland County Planning Department, that's myself and our 6 staff members here at the County Planning Department, providing the staff support to the County Planning Commission and carrying out the policy direction of the Cumberland County Board of Commissioners. I've already mentioned the Cumberland Area Economic Development Corporation. They're a great partner, looking out for the future, the economic health of Cumberland County, making sure that we have a rich tax base and plenty of jobs for our residents. And finally, Dickinson College. Dickinson College was a partner in putting this together and really gave us a lot of support in the organization of the program, helping to make sure that we have the right speakers and the right flow to the program. In particular, I'd like to thank Lindsay Lyons for her support, and Neil Leary, that while he's retired now, we do want to recognize him for the efforts he put into the program late last year. So the agenda that we'll follow this evening, we'll have brief introductions of our panelists, and then each of our panelists have a presentation. That'll take about an hour of our time. And then we have a moderated Q&A session that Janet and I will moderate. This moderated Q&A session really comes from the questions that many of you asked during the registration process. So we thank you for that. And hopefully the presentations tonight will respond to those questions. If you have other questions tonight, there's instructions on the first page there of how to submit your questions through the Q&A feature here. Clearly, we don't have all night to answer questions. We have about 50 minutes. We'll do our best to get it to as many as we can. We'll also be posting answer those questions back onto our county webpage after the sessions is over. And finally, we'll talk about some next steps, encouraging you to continue the journey in this issue, not only this issue, but others that are facing Cumberland County, looking for ways for residents to get involved and continue to be involved in issues that we face in the future. So why did we host this session? Why did Cumberland County decide to do this? Data centers are really a new land use that we haven't seen at this scale in Cumberland County. There are data centers that are out there, but they're smaller in their scale and size. But the size of data centers now that we're seeing in Cumberland County are much larger. And we're seeing that pressure isn't limited to just Cumberland County, but Pennsylvania as a whole. So we need to be up to speed on what's going on with that land use and realize what it is and understand it as it's putting pressure on our communities. And there's unprecedented public interest. I think that by looking at tonight, right now we have 175 people on this session. There's others that are on YouTube. The public is very interested and very concerned about data centers. So one of the key functions of, I believe, of county government, County Planning Commission, is to get good information out there, making sure that our residents have correct information, balanced information of the pros and cons of land uses, not only this, but others that are facing our community. So that they have the information they need to work with their local elected officials on the decisions that are being made. One key point, though, is tonight we're not going to talk about a specific project proposal. We're all very much aware of Project Bolt in Middlesex Township. That's one of the largest projects in the state right now. We're not going to talk about specifics of that project. If you're interested in that project and want to provide public input on it, we really encourage you to work with Middlesex Township, go to the regularly scheduled Planning Commission meetings or Board of Supervisors meetings. Tonight's panel discussion is really going to be at a much higher level, broader level of the data center industry as a whole, and looking at the industry from a much broader level than just a project-specific level. We also want to talk about issues tonight that supersede municipal control. So one of the issues we've seen with this is that when we're talking about electric and water supply, these are issues that really aren't under the direct purview of the county or municipal elected officials. And quite honestly, they can be complicated and they can be very difficult to understand. So we're hoping tonight that some of those issues that are big, we can really kind of bring down to a more simple level so that everyone understands how the decisions are made and who's responsible for them. And the final piece here is most information sessions are held during the day. So I can speak for our planning department staff. I know we've probably attended 10, 15 sessions like this on data centers as staff members, but they're all held during the day. And as we've talked with our planning commission, we said a lot of the issues that we're looking at in those daytime sessions are of broad interest to our residents. And this is an opportunity to do some things after hours, for after business hours, but the hours when you are most available. So we're hopeful that tonight's information session won't be the end, but maybe the start of other information sessions, not on this topic, but others as well, that are held in the evening when our residents are most available. So why this format? Initially, we're going to have it in person. The interest in it really overwhelmed the facility we were looking at. And the more we started to talk about the function of this program, it was really on listening and learning. As I mentioned earlier, it's not about a specific project. So trying to take feedback on a specific project wasn't in the purview of what we wanted to do tonight. We also wanted to have a broad perspective, not project specific. So we felt like this broader perspective, webinar style format was best suited to that. The organized Q&A session also allows for residents to ask their questions in an organized manner and make sure that your question gets asked and answered in a timely manner, that you're not sitting waiting while others may be asking questions that may not be questions that you would ask, but you'd have to sit and wait until the end of that Q&A session to get your questions answered. And finally, the video is accessible after the session. So one of the issues that we try and look at from the County Planning Commission, we're communicating with our residents, we try and meet them where they're at. And where they're not at is 8 to 4:30, as we mentioned earlier, at regular business hours to attend sessions like this. So we're doing them after hours. We're also recording them and putting them on videos so that residents at any point can go and watch the session and get the information they need regarding data centers. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists now and then get right into our presentations. Our first panelist is Pete McGrath. He's a Senior Vice President for Data Center and Development Construction for American Real Estate Partners. So Pete has a very deep portfolio of data center projects he's worked on in Virginia and throughout the Mid-Atlantic. Pete is involved in the Middlesex Township project, but tonight's focus is really going to be on his experience and portfolio of projects he's done elsewhere. I think that rich history that he's done, that rich experience he has, can really bring to bear to Cumberland County and Pennsylvania of what are we looking at, what are the trends in the industry, and how can we really see the industry move forward in a manner that's consistent with our keeping our quality of life. Secondly, we have Patrick Shaughnessy. He's a senior budget analyst and advisor to Chairman DeFrank for the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. PUC is really looking out for ratepayers when it comes to various utilities. Patrick's going to be talking to us tonight about the PUC's role in looking at increasing utility rates and are they caused by data centers? A common question that's regularly answered. So we're happy to have Patrick here tonight to help us out answer those questions with regard to electric utilities. We also have Todd Eby. He's the manager of project review for the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. Water is another huge issue with data centers. Todd will be talking about tonight the SRBC's regulatory review and oversight for water withdrawals throughout the basin, and talk about how he's protecting the water supplies in our communities throughout Cumberland County and throughout the watershed. Finally, we have Kyle Hart with us. He is one of the founding members of the Virginia Data Center Reform Coalition. He's currently with the Mid-Atlantic. He's a Mid-Atlantic Senior Program Manager for the National Parks and Conservation Association, where he's also working on data center issues. Kyle also has a rich history of working with data centers in the Virginia area, and I believe he has a lot of great experience, a lot of lessons learned and best management practices that he'll be sharing with us tonight. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and our first speaker tonight is Pete. So Pete, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kirk. Give me 1 second and I will get up on the screen. Okay, thank you, everybody. Sorry, let me turn my camera on. Thank you, everybody. Good evening. Appreciate you having me here tonight. My name is Pete McGrath. I'm a Senior Vice President, Development and Construction with American Real Estate Partners, Powerhouse Data Centers. I've been in the construction industry for a little over 30 years here in the Mid-Atlantic, and I have been in the data center construction industry for about 8 years, previously with a hyperscaler and now currently with Powerhouse, American Real Estate Partners. I'm here to provide a little bit of insight from the industry, again, not project specific, but provide a window into how we develop sites, what are the important factors in locations, touch on some of the utility aspects, and just generally provide a little bit of insight to those of you who maybe don't know a lot about data centers themselves. So first up, what is a data center? A data center is simply a centralized building to store and process data. It is essentially a warehouse for data. It's integral to a lot of the different industries in our economy today: hospitals, banks, finance, government, schools, every aspect of online commerce, and virtually every company these days utilizes some form of the internet, which is supported by a data center. They require backups and redundancy for mission critical operations, so they can be available to the customers at any and all times. And they have robust security systems, everything from fencing to physical security and cameras to cybersecurity aspects. Ultimately, sort of a core goal of all data center companies is to protect the customer data. So what does a data center physically look like? And I kind of use a car analogy here. They come in every shape and size, right? There's large ones, small ones, different flavors, different colors, just a varied look to the data centers, but typically designed to look like warehouses or industrial office complexes. They are typically 1 to 3 stories tall, depending on the jurisdiction. Sometimes in more urban areas, they are taller, but generally 1 to 2 and sometimes 3 stories. Usually made of a concrete wall exterior. Painted concrete is often used, with metal panel accents and windows. Again, trying to make it blend in with the surroundings, look like a warehouse industrial office complex. They have robust power and cooling systems with, again, redundancy, lots of backup systems. And just interior wise, they have spaces that are dedicated as offices, infrastructure rooms, they have storage rooms. And the heart of a data center is the server room, also known as a data hall. And so just analogy wise, again, I like to say they look like a Home Depot. So you see this picture bottom right corner of the screen. This is just a picture I took off the internet of a interior of a data center. You have a long hallway, kind of a main hallway running off into the back of the picture, and there are rows with metal racking systems holding computer products. So if you were my Home Depot analogy is, if you're in a Home Depot and you walk into the building, there's a main corridor with individual rows, and each row has a different product. There's orange racks with shelves holding products. The interior of a data hall server room looks very similar, just a different type of product. There are different types of data centers. Enterprise data centers are owned and operated by one particular company for their own use. This is very popular with the government, and it's also very popular with financial institutions like banks and credit card companies. Co-location facilities are shared facilities. So a particular company owns the building, provides power and cooling and internet connectivity to the customers, and the customers essentially rent floor space, and they bring their own computers into that facility. Cloud data centers, also known as hyperscale, are more of a shared environment. The building is owned by the cloud company, the Googles of the world. The computers are owned by the cloud company, but the users rent space on the server. They don't rent square footage on the floor. They actually just rent space on the server, and whatever services they use, they pay for those services. And finally, edge data centers are smaller data centers, a little closer to the users, especially specific users that have speed requirements, and financial systems, streaming, gaming. So they're a little smaller. They're usually built adjacent to a niche customer who is not close to a traditional data center. Why do data centers matter? So data centers are key to the internet, which is in today's world a modern day utility. So utilities to me mean electricity, water, sewer, and the internet. And just like a power plant provides electricity, a water treatment plant provides fresh water, a data center provides the internet that powers apps and websites and all the digital services that people use today. They keep daily life running. You use them for streaming movies, emailing, online shopping, banking, social media, Google Maps. All of those those types of services rely on the backbone that is in a data center somewhere in the US. They support critical infrastructure, so the healthcare, hospitals, emergency response, 911 call centers. Again, all of these types of services rely on applications that are hosted in data centers across the country. They fuel the economy, they fuel innovation from cloud computing, remote work, Zoom calls. All of those types of applications rely on the core infrastructure that is inside the data centers around the world, the country. And data centers are increasing in demand. There is generally an understanding that there's approximately 33% growth annually between now and 2030. That's to provide capacity needed to provide these services to all of us as customers. So aesthetics are a big concern with a lot of feedback we get from jurisdictions and from residents. Data centers are thoughtfully designed to complement the surroundings. 20 years ago, when there really weren't a lot of data centers, they were oftentimes just sort of put up, and they are, older ones can look like a gray box. Nowadays, architects and designers in companies like myself, developers, we meet with jurisdictions, we get feedback, we make sure that the architecture, the landscaping, it enhances the neighborhoods where they're built. The main picture on this slide is a rendering of a data center that we built in Virginia. The pictures on the right-hand side are actual photos of it when it was completed. So just to show that that there are, in fact, aesthetically pleasing data centers. I've got a question here. I'll answer it real quick in flight. Can data centers plant trees to offset environmental impact? Absolutely. Data centers are one of the most kind of robust I say planters of trees, but use of architecture, both from an aesthetics to make sure that the data center itself blends to the community, but also obviously trees are a great screen, and we like to plant a lot of them, as many jurisdictions don't want to see a data center if possible. They like to try to blend it in with the neighborhood. So those additional trees, thoughtful landscaping certainly helps to offset any sort of carbon impacts. One of the biggest questions that we get is, what is the impact? How does what's in it for me as a jurisdiction for having a data center built in my neighborhood? Right in the immediately out of the gate, construction jobs and jobs in general are extremely important to a jurisdiction. A typical data center will take anywhere from 18 to 36 months to build. And these numbers, 1,500 to 3,500 construction jobs, are needed to complete these campuses over years. Again, that's 18 to 36 months for one building. When you have multiple buildings, that buildings that obviously stretches over a campus. So local contractors, local vendors providing jobs, buying materials, buying equipment from those local vendors provide a lot of economic impact to many jurisdictions. Permanent jobs. So data centers, are known. I think everybody understands that data centers don't have hundreds and thousands of people working in them after completion, but a typical 250,000 square foot data center will have approximately 50 permanent jobs, each of them with approximate salaries, $80,000 to $120,000 in salary. And every direct job supports additional jobs in the community, technicians, material suppliers, security. All of these types of jobs are needed to support the actual data centers themselves. And so again, it's additional jobs, it's additional revenue for the jurisdiction. And finally, tax and fiscal impact. Data centers are among the highest assessed commercial properties per square foot. All of that tax revenue directly benefits school districts and local governments. And while, as I noted, data centers do not employ hundreds and thousands of people each, they also do not require much demand of public services. You do not need to build new schools because there's a huge influx of students. There are a low need for emergency calls or light traffic when the data center is complete. So the offset is that there isn't a big fiscal impact from a tax revenue standpoint, with not a lot of fiscal drag from a services requirement. So I wanted to touch a little bit on factors of site selection, what makes a particular jurisdiction, particular piece of land attractive for a data center development. So kind of the first factor is really the availability and the proximity of utility power, right? So data centers require a reliable, high-capacity electrical infrastructure. That utility power, what that means to us is high-tension power lines, which you see in various parts of the county. Developers look at locations of power lines. They collaborate with a utility. We'll essentially go to a utility and say we're looking in this general area at siting a data center campus of approximately this size. Does your system have capacity to serve us? If the utility says no, then it doesn't work. If this utility says absolutely, we can sell you that power. It tends to help us hone in on a particular piece of property and what makes it more attractive. Second factor is the cost of the land and the regulatory predictability in that jurisdiction. Certainly cost of land, like anything, is a factor in whether a particular site is attractive for a development. But also we need to understand as developers and as the industry, how sort of streamlined is the zoning and the permitting and the entitlement process? Do we understand how it works? Is there a regulatory framework in place that helps us understand whether a development is feasible in that jurisdiction? So that predictability helps us understand in the long term whether it's a good site or it won't work for a development. And finally, the labor pool and the skilled construction workforce. So labor pool meaning post-construction jobs, but certainly construction. Obviously, these data centers require a large workforce. If there is not that pool of skilled construction workforce, it makes it very difficult to build a data center, obviously, as we need to. Also, equally as important is having the staff that can provide, that can work in that data center after we complete it. Do the people have the necessary facility management skills, the engineering skills, IT infrastructure? Having those skills in the region is also hugely important for the success of the operations of that data center itself. So one of the biggest concerns that we hear as an industry, and believe me, I hear it regularly, are water and water use and water consumption. So I want to explain a little bit of how we approach water in a jurisdiction, and it's whether it's in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania as a whole, or anywhere really in the country. We approach a water utility with a location. Let's say we have a proposed location, and we approach a water utility with an idea of how much water we need. We ask the utility, does your system have available capacity that we can purchase to provide water for our campus? The utility reviews their infrastructure, what they have, the capacity in their system, and they tell us, we can provide you this much, or we can provide you that much. And then we design our campus around those needs. We don't come in and try to take all of the water. We ask the utility tells us what they have available. And if that's availability works for us, we will try to develop. If it does not, we don't. It's very simple. The numbers that I think people hear are it's a large numbers, several 100,000 gallons a day. Those numbers are, I want to clarify this note. Those represent the maximum allowable use in a day. For the most part, out of 365 days of the year, the majority of the days of the year, we do not use very much water for at least half of the year through the winter, from generally November to April. We don't use really any water except for sewer and water for the office spaces. Only when we have a really high, hundreds of thousands of gallons a day ask, that applies to the hottest couple of days of the year. Beyond that, we tend to try to utilize basically outside air, even if it's warm, that doesn't need water. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that. And as an industry, we understand the concerns with water usage, and the industry is trying to evolve and working through evolution of new technologies to lower water use. Data center companies align with sustainability commitments. That is one of the highest priorities for data center developers, to reduce the amount of resources, because we understand the concerns from the communities. Ultimately, lower water usage, it benefits us as much as it benefits the community, as we It's a lower cost for us up front. We don't have to build all of the infrastructure needed, and we don't have to buy that water over long-term use of the facility. So lowering water use is as much in our interest as anyone else's. I want to touch on a little bit of the evolution of some of the technology I mentioned earlier, of where the industry is going and how it is working to try to reduce the amount of water used. Today's technology for a lot of data centers uses what's called evaporative cooling. Again, for most of the days, the majority of the 365 days of the year, they use outside air, which is called free air or free cooling. You simply take the outside air and you use it to cool the interior of the building. When the environmental conditions demonstrate a need for water in those really hot days, we start to utilize water in what's an open loop system where we blow water through what is essentially a wet sponge, utilizing the principle of evaporation. Just like when you're hot and you're outside and you're sweating, but the wind blows over your arm, you feel cool. That same principle is utilized in a data center to blow air through essentially a wet sponge. Some of the water evaporates, some of it is absorbed into the air, blows into the data center and cools the data center. Many jurisdictions use what's called reclaimed water or recycled water, where they take sewage and remove the solids, and that exactly what you think that means is what it means. We remove the solids, or the utilities remove the solids out of the sewage, treat it in a minimal level to make sure it's not dangerous, and then reuse it for industrial applications like us. There are a number of jurisdictions in Virginia that use this, and it conserves fresh water. It reduces the amount of potable water, drinkable water that the facility needs. So that's one way one technology that a lot of jurisdictions and a lot of data center users are using to reduce the amount of water used. Tomorrow's technology coming in the near couple of years is what's called liquid to the chip cooling. So water and glycol, liquid, are much more efficient at cooling a data center than air is. This liquid to the chip is much more efficient than evaporative cooling. So they use a closed loop system, which is whatever water and glycol mix goes into that system stays in that system. It doesn't evaporate. It's not replaced. It's a closed loop system to remove the heat directly from the servers. Again, much more efficient. And they're kind of in technology demonstrator phase. They're companies that are inventing this technology are trying to make sure it works. It is not ready for primetime rollout, but it will be in the coming years. And future technology, which is call it second gen, 2 gens away from now, so it's called immersion cooling, which is essentially a bathtub filled with a specialized dielectric fluid that doesn't conduct electricity, and the servers sit in that bathtub full of fluid. Again, it's a closed loop. The fluid stays, it doesn't evaporate, it just stays in that system. And that system is ultra efficient in cooling, very minimal water use. And it's again, on the horizon. It's very recent inventions, but it's probably where most of the future of the data center cooling industry will go. I want to touch a little bit on self-generation. This is another comment that we hear frequently. So self-generation is now part of some data center developments. It's just beginning around the country. But as a data center developer, if I go to a utility and ask them for power, unless they have a particular area where they have spare capacity, it takes years to get that interconnection. It takes a long time to build the infrastructure. It just takes a long time. One of the requests from the utilities is our industry able to self-generate in some cases. It doesn't bypass the utility, but it provides additional capacity that we pay for that goes into the electric grid that we then take out of the electric grid as necessary. There are benefits to that. We don't compete with the existing customers in the existing grid, homes and businesses in the existing grid. We don't have to run new transmission lines. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the industry tries to put data centers adjacent to a high tension line, as you see on the screen. If we generate on the campus, we can put power right back into the grid via that connection to the tension line. So it removes the need to add new transmission lines through areas. And in some cases, it reactivates existing assets. There are a lot of places around the country where there are generating plants that are not online because there are not enough customers to need it yet. One of the examples of this in this region in central Pennsylvania is one of the hyperscalers has a deal with 3 Mile Island to restart one of their reactors that has been offline because there has been a lack of customers. They are reactivating, this hyperscaler is paying all of the costs to reactivate that reactor and put this power back into the grid. So it is a thing. It's very early in this, from being adopted in the industry as it's brand new, but it is a way that utilities have asked our industry to try to help in the future. Useful life, refresh, and decommissioning. Again, another question we hear a lot of. Data centers are a long-term investment. They have a 25 to 40-year useful life. They are, in some cases, billions of dollars in investment. So data center owners and operators are looking to keep these buildings in operation for many, many years. They have a strong financial incentive to keep them online, and they do that by upgrading. They don't abandon. They don't abandon and just build a new one next door. They upgrade the systems due to the level of financial commitment. Equipment, mechanical, electrical infrastructure is refreshed on regular cycles to keep up with new technologies. Computers inside are also refreshed as in shorter cycles, so that again that investment is necessary to keep competitive in the market, and they are always trying to upgrade as necessary. And it's really it kind of protects the operator and the community. There's reputational and financial risk if a data center operator just decides to abandon a facility. That's not something that a community really wants to hear, and no other community is ever going to be interested in working with that operator again if that's how they treat the communities they're in. So there are major risks and major incentives for these companies to keep these buildings operating. Last slide here. I'm running a little long. I apologize. I want to acknowledge that we as a community are addressed. We want to know that, let you know that we hear your concerns, and they are between residents and jurisdictions. They are utilized. As an industry, we are utilizing those concerns to try to become a better community partners, better operators in the industry. We're working on technology improvements to lower water use, working on technologies to reduce strain on the grid and make sure we're not passing costs on to customers. We're paying for infrastructure upgrades, hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure upgrades, to make sure that we pay for those upgrades that are needed for us, that the community doesn't. We're working with communities, refreshing technology and designs to make sure that sound is kept on the campus. Sound is a concern. So we're always trying to make sure that we do everything we can to keep our sound within our walls. Traffic management, certainly during construction there are traffic, but afterwards we do everything we can to work with the jurisdiction to manage that traffic and make sure that we're keeping we're being good neighbors. We're not damaging roads, and if we do, we replace things. We're trying to be good neighbors because we hear you as concerns. So hear your concerns, excuse me. So appreciate the time. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thanks a lot, Pete. A lot of good information there. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A, so Pete, can take a look at some of those. You may be able to answer some of those live. Next up, Patrick Shaughnessy with PUC. Patrick, it's all yours.
All right, thank you very much, and I would like to thank the Cumberland County Planning Commission for putting this together. As Pete said, and Kirk said, this is a really, really critical issue. Sort of a generational one, I will say, and presents a lot of challenges, I think, but also some opportunities. Kirk said, I'm Pat Shaughnessy. I work as a policy advisor to PUC Chairman Steve DeFrank. So I am going to run through some sort of updates on what we're doing at the commission, some of the sort of jurisdictional questions here. I've been working with the public utility commissions, both here in Pennsylvania and in Oregon, for about 5 or 6 years. I also worked on energy policy in our state legislature, the Pennsylvania state legislature, for several years. So I've approached this issue from a number of sort of different angles. So, happy to have this discussion. So, I figured I would cut right to the chase from, what people really want to hear, I suspect, from the Public Utility Commission with respect to data centers, which is, what is the impact here on energy costs? We know that, utility bills are rising. They're an increasing concern for a lot of people. And, data centers are a part of that in the electric sector. But, I just wanted to give a little bit of explanation of sort of how these costs work and where data centers might sort of fit in. And I figured I would start with a quick overview of the sort of way that the utility system is set up. There's, three sort of main components to it. You have your generation side. So, think power plants. The main sort of price drivers here are the price to operate the power plants to sort of keep them online, and then the actual energy cost, the commodity cost. Transmission costs are the wires that get your power from the power plant down to sort of local level. The transmission lines, think of the big sort of three phase towers that you see out in sort of rural areas. And then you have the distribution system. This is your local network. This is the lines that you see on poles in your neighborhood. This is PPL. This is First Energy. This is Duquesne Light. So I can tell you that, the prices, the portions of your bill that are divided between these three sectors are sort of roughly 30 to 40% for generation, another 30 to 40% for distribution, and then transmission makes up the remainder of it. The distribution system, that's, regulated by the Public Utility Commission. That's mostly infrastructure upgrades just to keep the local network reliable. And, there's really not a lot of sort of data center impact there. Transmission, most data centers are sort of high voltage customers. They're what we refer to as transmission customers. They're really hooking into the high voltage lines, the sort of, like I said, the three-phase towers and things like that. So they're often requiring, sort of upgrades to the transmission system. That might mean new substations. That might mean running new lines. And, one of our jobs at the Public Utility Commission, and also, I will say at the federal level, and I will get into that later, is how do you apportion those costs? I will note here that while, there are going to be cost increases on the transmission system, there are also potentially benefits, and data centers might in some senses actually lower transmission costs in some ways. And I'll give you sort of a quick example. Transmission rates are pretty simple. It's the amount of power that's moving across the system divided by sort of the number of customers. It's a pretty simple sort of fraction. And in this case, we might think, if you think about the costs, the equipment that's necessary to sort of power, say, a city like Pittsburgh, you're talking about thousands of substations, thousands of miles of line and things like that. You have a lot of capital costs there that you're dividing by the sort of number of kilowatts moving through the system. I will note sort of at the distribution level, but for the transmission system, it's similar. You're taking the cost of all the transmission infrastructure and you're dividing it by the number of units, number of kilowatts that are moving through it. Data centers are sort of unique. They're a completely unique customer in this respect because, you might be building fairly limited infrastructure and often at the cost of the customer. So you're not really increasing the total cost of the system, but they are huge, huge customers. So if you think about it, the sort of numerator, the total cost of the infrastructure is increasing sort of minimally, but the denominator, the number of kilowatts that are moving through the system are increasing dramatically. And so you actually might see falling transmission rates in some cases, but that actually depends on both the federal government at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and us at the Public Utility Commission sort of doing our jobs to allocate these costs correctly. On the generation side, and this is, there's been a lot of news about this, PJM, which I will get to in a second, is sort of the grid operator for Pennsylvania. They're the ones that manage, and for many, many states, and they're the ones that sort of are responsible or lead to generation costs. I will I will try not to belabor you with detail, but sort of capacity costs are sort of almost like a retainer. They are the sort of paying for the fixed costs to make sure that we have power plants that are online and available to produce power when we need it. Capacity costs had been sort of very, very low for a very, very long time. We had had a couple of decades where there was very minimal load growth. There was not a lot of new demand coming onto the system. So capacity prices were very, very low. Then, a couple years ago, for the first time in a long time, not only did our load forecast, the amount of demand on our system increase, it increased dramatically. And those capacity costs, which had been, about $25 per megawatt day. I won't get into too much detail about this, though I'm happy to sort of follow up in the Q&A. In a couple of years ago, those capacity costs increased by tenfold. They went from $25 to $250. They were actually projected to go even higher, but Governor Shapiro actually sort of intervened and actually got a price cap in place. So we have a few years, the next couple of years, where those generation prices, those capacity prices are going to be capped. So moving on, as I said, this is sort of this is going to be a collaborative effort because the energy system has sort of some jurisdictional questions. That the generation and the transmission systems that I mentioned, those are considered interstate issues. So they are therefore subject to sort of the federal government. They're subject to federal jurisdiction. That's mainly carried out by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and subject to a federal law called the Federal Power Act. They are the ones that are responsible for approving transmission rates because those transmission systems are interstate assets. And they're the ones that are responsible for regulating the PJM, which again, I will put a pin in that, which is the sort of wholesale market operator. On the state jurisdictional side, and these are the things that we at the PUC can actually affect, we have, sort of retail regulation. And what that means is regulation of the end use customer. And that means retail regulation covers everything from sort of setting retail prices for customers in terms of approving distribution rates to setting terms for the interconnection of customers, including, data centers and new large loads, which are sort of a new and unique customer class. As I said, we're also responsible for distribution rates. Those are the section of your utility bill that's directly attributable to PPL or First Energy, probably in your case. And then we're also responsible for sort of allocating the local transmission costs. When some transmission projects that only are going to be built within Pennsylvania and have no sort of broader implications to the interstate grid do fall more closely under just PUC jurisdiction rather than sort of implicating federal jurisdiction. And when those sort of projects arise, for example, if a data center is going to be built somewhere in Pennsylvania that requires a new substation, allocation of those costs, which part of those costs go to the data center versus which part gets sort of socialized out to the rest of the system, that is something that we have some control over at the PAPUC. So I've now sort of mentioned it a couple of times, and I'll sort of explain this in some detail, although I won't go too far into it. So the PJM interconnection. For a long time, when I worked in the legislature, I used to joke that PJM was sort of the most important institution that nobody had ever heard of. PJM runs an interstate grid. They're what's called a regional transmission operator or an independent system operator. There are several of these around the country, but they run the electric grid for the entire mid-Atlantic all the way out to Illinois. It covers 13 states plus the District of Columbia. And they are responsible for running a grid that serves about 65 million people. They are the ones that run what are called our capacity auctions. Those are the ones that set those are the sort of mechanism, the market mechanism that sets those capacity costs that I was talking about. They're the ones that run the auction where that the capacity price increased tenfold sort of unexpectedly. They have a few sort of major policies that they are working on right now specific to data centers. And I want to spend some time on these because, these are obviously of great concern to everyone. They're a major sort of focus of my time. This is sort of one of the major issues that I sort of work on behalf of Chairman DeFrank. So there's a lot of concern about how we are going to procure enough power for these data centers. Just to give you sort of a little sense of this, of how just explosive the demand growth for electricity has been. PPL, I'm here in Harrisburg. They're my utility. Their peak demand, their highest demand on the hottest summer day when everybody is running their air conditioning is, somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think about 14,000 megawatts. And it took them, more than 100 years to build up to that peak demand. We're forecasting that if all the data centers that have indicated interest in locating in PPL are built, they will double that in the next couple of years. And we are not the only jurisdiction that sees that. Most of the states in PJM are seeing that. Another sort of, example here, there is a data center project being built by Amazon Web Services that's up in the Poconos. In the sort of first phase of it, it's expected to have demand of about 500 megawatts. That's about equivalent to the city of Pittsburgh. So you can see how sort of unprecedented this load growth is. So PJM has been sort of trying to find a way that they can procure power for these data centers, without without driving up the prices, without making them compete with the rest of us, for sort of mom and pop customers, for small businesses, for residential ratepayers. So they're running what is called a reliability backstop procurement, which is where they're going to sort of try to find new generation sources. So they don't want to sort of cannibalize the existing generation market because that'll just drive up prices for everyone. But they're going to try to find, put together sort of bilateral contracts in the first instance so that you can have, sort of, as Pete mentioned, that would be similar to the instance where Microsoft is sort of paying full freight to get one of the reactors at 3 Mile Island back online. But, these data centers could sign bilateral contracts to get a whole new generation station built. That would be sort of the most convenient way to do it and the safest for other ratepayers. One of the big concerns that, my boss has, that Chairman DeFrank has, that I have, is shielding regular ratepayers from the risk of stranded assets. We are aware that some of these data centers, I saw a question from, I think it was Natalie, about why there were so many requests, sort of new interest in data centers recently. And, a lot of those projects are certainly going to get built, but we have pretty firm indication that in a lot of cases, data centers might be sort of indicating interest in a number of different sites. In other words, there might be sort of duplicative requests here. They might be trying to start siting and zoning and things like that in a place in Ohio, but also a place in Pennsylvania so that they can see sort of where they can get operational more quickly. One of the things that we are working on, and this is something we're doing in collaboration with the rest of the public utility commissions from the PJM states, is to sort of see what we can do to dig through our data and try to get a sense of, how many of those duplicative requests there are. Because the last thing we want to do is, build expensive new transmission lines or expensive new power plants. They're not really going to be needed because maybe some of these data centers are not actually likely to materialize. And, there's a serious risk that those stranded costs, any of those excess costs that were expended now, might fall on ordinary ratepayers. And that's sort of the last thing we want. So that's something that we're sort of working on closely with PJM, with the governor's office, and, sort of with our counterparts in other states. Another sort of major policy that PJM is working on is what they're referring to as connect and manage, which is, these data centers are, they're coming, and it might be a while. The sort of the timeline to get a new generation station online is a lot longer in some instances than the amount of time it takes to build a new data center. So what do we do in the sort of interim? And, one obvious option that we are exploring is, we will certainly assist data centers in getting interconnected as expeditiously as possible. but we might put sort of stipulations on them that, you know, in instances of grid stress on those really hot summer days, in those, you know, few hours a year when the grid is sort of maxed out, then they might have to be curtailed, that they might have to reduce their use or switch to backup power generation on their own site or things like that. That is a policy that is being worked on, like I said, first at PJM, but will ultimately probably be subject to state jurisdiction. We are not quite sure what that policy is going to look like when it comes from PJM. That is something that will also have to be sort of approved by FERC at the federal level. As I said, there is a lot of sort of jurisdictional issues here, and I don't mean issues sort of problematically, but there's a lot of players involved in this. And I will just mention quickly, and you know, maybe those who signed up and who have email addresses sort of registered, I can provide links to Cumberland County to PJM's websites, because they're running sort of stakeholder processes that are open to the public on both of these issues. You know, I would hardly recommend that anybody listen to a PJM meeting unless maybe you need, you know, sort of help sleeping. But you know, if you're really interested, you know, that you can get some good information there. And then finally, I'll just mention another major component of PJM, which is its Transmission Expansion Advisory Committee. I will say that this is one of the ones that actually a lot of sort of normal ratepayers participate in, and that is the portion of PJM that sort of approves transmission projects. There are a lot of transmission projects already being built, already being approved, already being cited, et cetera, that are, you know, mostly for data centers. And, you know, there's questions about exactly how that cost allocation is going to work. And I'll sort of return to that also in a second. So one thing that we are working on here at the Public Utility Commission is a special tariff for large loads. And, you know, that would encompass data centers, but also some sort of, you know, advanced manufacturing facilities and things like that, which, you know, their impact on the grid is unique, just because their demand is so much larger, even more, you know, significantly greater than what we used to think of as big customers, which would be aluminum smelters, steel mills, things like that. And these might be, you know, double, triple, or in some cases an order of magnitude larger than that. So we wanted to create a new tariff that was going to apply and set, you know, specific conditions for these new customers to get hooked up. I will say, you know, I would, if you're interested in this, you know, sort of pay attention closely to the news, because there might be some sort of news on this in the very short future. We had issued an interim order that was open for public comment on, you know, precisely what conditions we should set within this tariff. And that's going to be finalized, so actually promulgated by the commission in very short order. I'll mention, you know, that this is a model tariff, so these are strong suggestions from the commission indicating our preferences, what we think are best practices here. Will not have the force of law, or force of regulation, although, you know, we may consider sort of moving to a formal rulemaking process that would then make these conditions mandatory. I wish that we had actually finalized this into a final order, because then I could have put some actual sort of details to some of these things that I have here on my slide, which are the main issues that we're sort of discussing in this procedure. But I can give you just, you know, some broad strokes here. You know, I'll also mention briefly, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you commented. We had a public comment period on this interim order, or that I think we had hundreds and hundreds of commenters, thousands of pages. It was actually a very fulsome discussion of the issue that I really appreciated. So, you know, the first question is to set megawatt threshold. You know, what exactly is a large load? To whom should this new tariff apply? That question of who pays for infrastructure upgrades. You know, I'll mention quickly that generally speaking, infrastructure that serves one customer. So if there's, you know, a substation that is built that only serves a data center or an industrial customer, they are assigned 100% of the cost for that. If there is an infrastructure upgrade that is made sort of for that, because of that customer, but also has benefits to the rest of the system, then those costs are generally socialized. That is something that we are sort of considering changing in here. We've sort of considered moving to more of like a but-for cost test, which is to say, sure, this infrastructure upgrade could potentially or not even potentially, may benefit other customers. But for that one customer, the data center, the large industrial customer, it wouldn't have been built. And since they're the real cost causer, then they should bear the actual costs. We explored the possibility of having sort of large load customers make contributions to our universal service funds, which are, meant to help people that are struggling with utility bills. We sort of know that these, this explosive load growth we're having is going to drive up prices. So, we think it's sort of fair or reasonable to ask, some of these customers to make contributions to help defray those costs. Another major issue is, collateral requirements, sort of putting financial security or cash or whatever it may be on the line, so that if some of these customers don't materialize, or if they're exploring multiple sites, we don't sort of build infrastructure for customers that, don't show up, or, don't fully scale up to the original size or demand that they were expecting. And then those costs are sort of, left to be borne by the rest of the ratepayers, which, as I said, that's our main goal here, is to sort of avoid that. And then there are some other sort of contract terms. These data centers, it's not like you flip a switch and they come on and they're using a gigawatt of electricity. They sort of ramp up over multiple years. So we want to have some sort of insight into how that's going to work, and sort of how they manage those ramp terms with the utilities, setting minimum demand charges. So if they, are going to require infrastructure build up for a demand of 1,000 megawatts, we don't want them to then come back later and say, actually, we're only going to have demand of 500 megawatts, when, the utilities have already sort of sunk costs in those infrastructure and some infrastructure improvements. And exit fees, or early termination fees. So, if you leave before the term of your contract with the EDC, there has to be some sort of financial penalty there to make the EDC whole again, so that we don't have stranded costs that are then passed on to the remainder of the ratepayers. That's sort of some of the things that we're thinking about. Some of the things that will be settled, as I said, sort of very shortly, as we move this tariff from a sort of interim to a final state. I've provided some resources here, just a quick policy update. These are some of the major bills that are sort of moving in the Pennsylvania state legislature right now, dealing with data centers. They cover everything from water resource planning to tax credits to, establishing guidelines, requiring them, again, to sort of pay into low income programs, things like that. They sort of really run the gamut. I can't give you any particular insight, despite having worked in the Capitol and specifically in the legislature for a number of years, into which ones may or may not pass. I'd be somewhere else. I'm making a lot more money if I had that sort of predictive capability, but wanted to sort of make you aware. There was also, the PJM governors, so the governors of the 13 PJM states, and the White House's Energy Dominance Council issued a statement of principles, which, covered a lot of the things I've discussed. How are we going to get this new generation built, and these new infrastructure upgrades built, without passing the costs on to regular ratepayers that, are sort of innocent bystanders in this. And then finally, I would note it that, FERC has a potential rulemaking coming that might sort of claim federal jurisdiction over some of these issues. That I think they've made some indication that there might be a decision there in June. Not quite sure sort of what to make of that. So that's a sort of quick rundown. One thing that I sort of forgot to mention, I had mentioned that we're sort of working on trying to find duplicative, determine if there are sort of duplicative data center requests. Pennsylvania, as a sort of deregulated market state for our electric system, there's a lot of things that we haven't had to really do in a while. And, Chairman DeFrank has been very, very keen on sort of getting us up to speed. We haven't really had to do a lot of sort of load forecasting or resource planning in a long time, because, when we deregulated in the 90s, that was sort of passed on to the market. But, these are moving too quickly. The sort of amounts of money involved here that could potentially fall on ratepayers are too big. So, we're sort of we're really sort of rebuilding a lot of capacity, internal capacity at the commission, to sort of address these issues that, for a long time were sort of turned over to the market. And that's a major priority of my boss, Chairman DeFrank. You know, I hope I didn't rattle through that all too quickly. You know, I really look forward to the Q&A because I find that's often sort of a more productive way to sort of get some of these issues out. And I do see the Q&A sort of in the chat here. And now that I can focus, I'll be happy to sort of jump in the chat and answer any questions that I may have spawned. So I will call it there.
All right, thank you a lot, Patrick. Great presentation. We said we were going to cover some complex issues tonight they're bigger than a municipality or a county, and I think you just did that. So thanks again. For our panelists too, as you have some free time now after you've done your presentation, keep an eye on the Q&A. There's some questions that you might be able to answer. So with that, we'll move on to Todd Eby from SRBC. Todd, show is yours.
Okay, well, thank you. I really appreciate being able to participate in this information session and provide some information about the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, about our regulatory authority, our process of evaluating projects, and then how all that applies to data centers. So the Susquehanna River Basin it's a large basin. It's over 27,000 square miles, about the size of South Carolina. The Susquehanna River Basin Commission has regulatory authority in anywhere within the basin. So the commission is an interstate government agency with 4 partners being New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and the federal government. And we're really focusing on balancing economic development with the conservation of the aquatic ecosystems and water within the basin for multiple uses, both you know, individuals, companies, aquatic systems, you know, everything that needs water in the basin. That's what we're trying to balance. And we also have some you know, a lot of focus on water quality monitoring, flood and drought preparation, and just a large planning focus at the commission, in addition to the regulatory authority. So the regulatory authority is fairly narrowly focused. It's focused primarily on withdrawals of either groundwater or surface water and consumptive use of water. There are a few other aspects like diversions that they regulate, but I'm going to focus really just on groundwater withdrawals, surface water withdrawals, and consumptive use. The thresholds here are on the upper left-hand side of the slide, and the withdrawals are regulated at 100,000 gallons per day on a consecutive 30-day average. These are all triggered on consecutive 30-day averages. And then consumptive use is our lowest threshold at 20,000 gallons per day on a 30-day average. You know, data centers or any industry, any activity that exceeds these thresholds is regulated by the commission anywhere within the river basin. You know, and you know, point out here, any approvals or permits, they're not one size fits all. They're looked at. We have site-specific conditions depending on the setting and the situation. There can be restrictions. We often refer to them as low flow restrictions or flow protection or pass-bys. They have all projects that are approved have reporting requirements. We have a dedicated compliance department that goes out and can do inspections, data validation, making sure that projects are following any approval restrictions and limitations. And then these aren't, you know, once they have an approval, they're approved forever. They have time limits, and renewals aren't automatic. Primarily, projects have 15-year approvals. So all applications for water use require public notice, notifications to some regulatory agencies, local government. The commission staff coordinate with other agencies, regulatory agencies that have, you know, a regulatory authority that in some ways, sometimes that's it has some close authorities, and then other things like wastewater discharges and that kind of thing. The commission does not have any regulatory authority than that. And we're really set up to avoid duplication of the regulatory authorities and regulatory activities of other agencies. So we don't get involved in those kinds of things like wastewater discharges. Our review is really focused in water science. Groundwater withdrawals require hydrogeologic evaluations, which are often completed by aquifer testing, collection of data that we can evaluate the potential for adverse impacts from the withdrawal. We can evaluate sustainability. We do a yield and availability analysis to make sure that the water would be available even through what we call 1 in 10-year drought recurrence interval. There includes desktop environmental screening, site assessments. We're looking to see if there are any sensitive features in the area, some critical features that we need to consider while we're looking at this. And we're not just assessing the individual project and its water use. We're looking at cumulative impacts. Are there other users in the area that are also using? And we have to consider the full impact of all users in that area on that water system or within that groundwater recharge area. So we do both cumulative and individual impact analyses. We're looking at kind of like what I'm already been mentioning, sustainability for multiple users, making sure that we're trying to preserve water quality and not cause further degradation. We're looking to avoid loss of fishery habitats and aquatic ecosystems. We consider impacts on recreational uses. And once again, I already mentioned cumulative impacts. And then once again, permits, they're not one size fit all. There's been a lot of talk out in the public about lack of data, what's the actual usage. The commission requires metering and reporting of all water uses. We require monitoring of groundwater elevations in groundwater wells so we can evaluate ongoing performance of the well, make sure it's performing in the manner that we had determined it would perform. And projects are required to mitigate for adverse impacts if they were to occur. And we have water conservation standards, already mentioned low flow protection. Projects can have special monitoring if there's nearby sensitive features like, say, wetlands or even other users. We may require special monitoring to make sure that, once again, that the withdrawal would perform in the way that we had anticipated and determined, and then make sure we can use that monitoring to assess if there is an impact occurring, and then we can go in and address that situation, even adjust approvals or restrict approvals further. I already mentioned that we're non-duplicative. We often get questions about that and what the regulatory authorities are of other agencies. So it's something that we really are working hard to avoid that kind of duplication. Just a little bit about water use in the basin. Give you some perspective. Total withdrawals in the basin. This is just to give you a little bit of a snapshot. It's very large potential withdrawal, 3.3 billion gallons per day. The largest user for withdrawals is for electrical generation, and the second largest is public water supply. Consumptive use, it's a much lower number because a lot of the water that's withdrawn is returned to the waters of the basin. But the largest two users, again, are for electric generation, but public water supply is actually the largest consumptive user in the Susquehanna River Basin. Now, a lot of that is due to some large diversions out of the basin. Once that water is removed from our basin, it's no longer available for use. And so those diversions are considered to be consumptive use. So what's all this mean as far as water use in data centers? I mean, there's been a lot of description already about how data centers can use water. High-speed computing generates a lot of heat. Traditionally, a lot of these data centers were using straight evaporative cooling to address that excess heat. It was really a lot of because it was a technology that was already available, and people were familiar with it. Developers were familiar with it. There's some convenience with cost, and it's very effective, but it can use a lot of water. That straight evaporative cooling. The water for these facilities can be surface water, groundwater, public water supply. We see a variety of these things, and even treated wastewater. I know that Pete had mentioned use of treated wastewater. These facilities, we talked a lot about power demand. So one of the things that the commission is looking at and keeping an eye on is, are we going to see new power plants that may also be using water to support these data centers? So it's something that we have a lot of experience with power generation and power generation facilities and their water use. So we're just keeping an eye on that, and there's some concern, and why it's so important to us is because the water could actually hit twice if the data center would have evaporative cooling, and a new power plant to support that data center would have evaporative cooling. So we're keeping an eye on that. But there's options. There's cooling technologies, include the evaporative that we've been talking about. There's high water use. There's hybrid cooling, and Pete talked a little bit about this. Hybrid cooling uses less water. So hybrid is much of the time they're just using air-cooled systems, and then only during the hottest periods do they then supplement a little bit with some evaporative cooling to help get through some of those really high peak temperature days or periods. And then there's dry cooling, straight dry cooling, which is really the minimal water use, and even often that those systems could get below the commission's withdrawal thresholds and not require, and consumptive use and not require commission approval. So we see a lot of proposals for data centers. There's been a lot of discussion, but what have we actually been seeing so far? The commission has only issued one permit to one facility, and it's Amazon Data Services. They're approved for 129,000 gallons per day of consumptive use. That's the maximum. And that facility is using a hybrid system. So this is the maximum during the hottest days, the hottest periods. And for a large portion of the year, they wouldn't be using any water or very negligible water to achieve their cooling needs. But in that water, that 129,000 gallons, it's less than an average golf course irrigation in our basin. We see golf courses that use considerably more water than that. Then we have another application that is still in-house, and the project gets stalled. They had requested a consumptive use of 67,000 gallons per day. And it was, they were proposing to use municipal wastewater. So this is one of those wastewater systems. Instead of pulling fresh water out of a stream or out of the groundwater aquifers or from a public water supply, they were going to use wastewater. They're trying to work through some local approvals, but we're just waiting to see how that works out. We've had one application withdrawn. That project looked at the requirements and their options with cooling, and they decided to go dry cooling, and they are below threshold. They don't exceed the commission's threshold for water use. So this is a limited trend. We only have a couple projects that have actually really come into the commission, and we've talked to them about regulatory requirements, or that we've had applications submitted. So we're still watching, waiting, paying attention to a lot of it. I gave you some other comparisons previously, but power generation is usually in the tens of millions. food industry, different types of industry. Could be in the hundreds of thousands of gallons per day. Golf course irrigation, snowmaking, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. So just a little bit of perspective in what a data center can look like in comparison to some of the other industries. But really smart siting and the use of hybrid or dry cooling can really greatly reduce the water impacts, and that's what we're really focusing on. When you choose a cooling system that really reduces your water footprint or your water demand, then that frees the siting up to try to move those locations closer to things like power generation and good land to be able to develop the data centers. You can take advantage of some things like Keystone Opportunity Zones, that kind of thing, when you eliminate one of the other variables that you need to consider. If you're not having to also bring in water or locate close to sufficient water. You can use things like wastewater. We mentioned abandoned mine drainage water. That's preferable over freshwater or clean water sources. There can be lower operational costs when you reduce your water footprint. And I've already mentioned you could reduce or avoid the permitting or approval process with the commission entirely if get below the threshold with use of something like dry cooling technology. There's some lower application fees when they reduce their water demand. There can be quicker permitting through prioritized reviews and decreased liability mitigation requirements. So to encourage some of these hybrid systems and dry cooling systems, the commission adopted a dry cooling resolution several years ago. And initially it was focused on the power industry because a lot of those facilities that were being considered recently had opportunities to choose dry cooling to really reduce their water footprint and water demand. So this is just a little bit of a success story. In 2015, power company was high water use, up around 93 million gallons a day. So we adopted this resolution that encouraged the consideration of dry cooling. We had 4 new power plants now that have chosen that path, and they're using dry cooling in the basin. And really now we have 7 years of data and have some impressive results. It uses 98% less water than evaporative cooling. One of them is really reduced their public water supply demand. And then they have less water that they discharge. So that also helps with other permitting requirements from other agencies. So really down here, the numbers are pretty interesting. It avoids those facilities avoid 16 million gallons of consumptive use if they had chosen evaporative cooling, and that's 5.8 billion gallons of water a year. It's pretty impressive. That's how much water can be avoided. Water use can be avoided if they do dry cooling. So just recently we expanded the dry cooling resolution to encourage data centers and other large water users to consider this kind of innovative technology of these. But there are some other, water impacts. New power plants require cooling, which I just talked a little bit about, but there's some things that the commission, once again, does not regulate, but we often get a lot of questions about it because it's water related. Stormwater, runoff, wetland disturbance, discharges of cooling water. But so those things need to be considered, but other agencies have regulatory primacy for those things. The other thing just quickly I mentioned, SRBC wants to be a source for information. We have a lot of really good information on our website. There's a QR code here. We have a data center and water use webpage has a lot of good information on it. So you can take a screenshot of that or a snapshot of that. But our website really has a lot of good information, and we hope people take advantage of that. So here's my contact information. Once again, I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks a lot.
All right, thanks a lot, Todd. Great information there. If you could take a look at the Q&A, Todd, and there's a lot of questions in there for you that were popping up while we were talking. In particular, kind of what's SRBC's role on like a public water supplier. So check those out. I would also encourage all of our attendees to access the Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see participants chat, raise hand, share, and then Q&A. And then there's a more button. If you click the more button, that enables you to ask questions through the Q&A. So we want to do that. Some of you are raising your hand. We're unable to help out with hand raising for tonight's program. We need you to participate through the Q&A. So again, that's on the bottom of your menu, of the Zoom menu. You'll see it says more, and there'll be 3 dots. Click on that. You'll be able to access the Q&A. So with that, we'll bring up our final panelist tonight, Kyle Hart. It's all yours.
Thank you, Kirk. 1 second while I pull up my share screen. Appreciate everybody being here tonight. As Kirk said at the beginning of this presentation, my name is Kyle Hart, and I work for a nonprofit called the National Parks Conservation Association. Instead of my contact info being at the last slide like Todd's was, mine's here at the beginning. So if you wanted to snag that, I'm also happy to sort of share it, or maybe the organizers can share it afterwards. So as I mentioned, I work for a nonprofit called the National Parks Conservation Association. We are a nationwide nonprofit dedicated to protecting and enhancing America's 433 national park sites. We're more than 100 years old. We were founded in 1919. We have folks everywhere. As was mentioned at the beginning, I live in Richmond, Virginia, but we have folks on the ground in Pennsylvania. Renee, who lives in the Harrisburg area, and then Jada, who lives in the, I believe in the Pennsylvania, or I mean, sorry, in the Philadelphia area. So we are everywhere. We have folks on the ground in Alaska and Florida and everywhere in between. We work on things in Congress like park funding and creation of new parks, and you know, my job is a lot of protecting parks from threats on the ground. You can learn more about us at npca.org, and if you're interested in our work on data centers, you can just search NPCA data centers and it will come up. So we have been doing some version of data center work for about 5 years, a little bit more than 5 years now. This started in Virginia with a couple of projects proposed directly adjacent to national park sites. This one on your screen here is known as the Prince William Digital Gateway project, directly adjacent to Manassas National Battlefield Park. This was unfortunately not the only one we've seen in Virginia. There were, I believe, 4 others. So this is a good example of a really, really bad project that we are almost very close to defeating. They have lost a couple of times in court, and several of the developers have sort of pulled out, but a couple are still, or one of them is still hanging in there. So we will see, but that's what we do. We focus on threats to parks, and we also focus on sort of the cumulative impacts that the data center industry has on our collective environment. Water, obviously, loss of green space, power consumption and power source, potential impacts to clean air, and that sort of stuff. And I'll touch on that here in a little bit. So the data center industry is obviously one industry, but it has a lot of impacts. So in Virginia on the ground, it was announced in February by Dominion Energy that they have 70 gigawatts of data center energy demand in the queue. Now, what does 70 gigawatts mean, right? Like it's a weird number. 70 gigawatts is, you know, depending on how you shake it, 70 new nuclear power facilities, 70 new natural gas plants. You know, your average nuclear reactor is about a gigawatt. Your average natural gas plant is about a gigawatt. Obviously, there's a ton of variability there. Sort of a good comparison. So Virginia is currently building the largest of its kind offshore wind project off the coast of Virginia. That's a 2.6 gigawatt project that will cost about $10 billion. So, you know, I'm bad at math, but what is that? We would need 20 of those or so to meet that energy demand. If you wanted to do that in solar power alone, so solar is another interesting thing where, because the sun doesn't always shine, so there's something called nameplate capacity and then actual capacity. So for nameplate capacity alone, you would need about 700,000 acres of solar to feed just the data center industry. Alone in Virginia. But PJM doesn't sort of just rely on nameplate. If you're coupling in battery storage, they do a 2-to-1 nameplate. So you would need 1.4 million acres of solar. To put that into comparison, Shenandoah National Park is about 200,000 acres. So it's a lot of land. We also care a lot about the cumulative impacts of projects, as projects are being permitted, whether it's from a water supply perspective or an air permit perspective. 1 + 1 + 1 does not equal 1. So we're concerned about cumulative impacts. And sort of our big takeaway, which I'll talk a little bit about more, is as states and localities like Cumberland County or Pennsylvania or others are thinking about data center development, you need a plan. Virginia did not have a plan, and this is the result of that. So we just released a report a couple of weeks ago that kind of highlights sort of the far-reaching impacts of data centers and how they impact national parks. And so the red, orange, and yellow lines you'll see kind of on the screen are new transmission lines being brought in. As you can see, all of the power is flowing into Northern Virginia Data Center Alley. All of those orange and red dots are either existing or proposed data centers. Northern Virginia alone, you'll see on the bottom left, has 6.2 gigawatts of existing data center energy consumption. So we're talking about 10xing that in theory in the coming years. That is not an insignificant change to the grid system in Virginia, and of course to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, some of these lines are going to go through Pennsylvania in part, and so that's cost borne by folks in Pennsylvania so that Virginia can have its data centers. And that should concern folks. So what are the environmental impacts of data centers? Just very quickly, obviously land use, depending on the project, anywhere from 20, 30 acres to, that Digital Gateway project I showed was 2,133 acres. Some sites out west, like Texas, is talking about 10,000 acre projects, so pretty big. The land use type is industrial. As Pete talked about, from an exterior, kind of depending on the size and the height of the building, they are, individual buildings, no different than sort of other industrial uses once, the dust settles from the construction. It's those other after the fact impacts that we are concerned about, of course, going beyond site selection and where industrial development does and doesn't belong. Water use and water quality, which of course we've heard about tonight, air quality, energy, and how the production of said energy impacts our climate, our global climate. New energy infrastructure, of course, as I highlighted on the last slide, new power lines, substations, and generation stations, or, depending on the type of generation, solar, wind, gas, nuclear, take your pick. And of course, in proximity to data centers, noise, view sheds, construction impacts, the industry has made great strides in being better about a lot of these things, but the fact of the matter is there are people in Northern Virginia living in their basements because of data center noise. It's well documented, that is true. People deal with years of construction noise in their backyards due to poorly planned and poorly sited and approved projects. That's not necessarily the fault of the industry. That's probably more the fault lies there with the board of supervisors that approved projects of only 100, 200 feet from houses. But that is what is happening. So as was mentioned at the beginning, I co-founded with a bunch of other partners, environmental and community groups in Virginia, a coalition called the Virginia Data Center Reform Coalition. We were formed in sort of 2023 in response to unchecked data center sprawl across the state, and that sprawl has only magnified and the need for reform has only grown. We are a statewide coalition, so we're really proud to have sort of member groups and members, not just in Northern Virginia, but across the state where data centers are planned and operational, everything from, way down in Southwest Virginia and Botetourt County, Central Virginia, Richmond area, and more. We advocate at the Virginia Data Center Reform Coalition largely for statewide oversight and reforms, some of which I'll highlight in a bit. And of course, we try to protect communities and the environment. So as I talked about earlier, land use beyond just the footprint of data centers are inherently land hungry because they're energy hungry. As data centers rely on clean energy, more and more land will need to go to solar farms, and NPCA is very cognizant of the fact that we need to decarbonize our grid and move towards a net zero future to address the worst impacts of climate change. But, I think the scale of what's being talked about to the tune of, 7 million or 700,000 to 1.4 million acres is something to note and be concerned about. Other energy sources, transmission lines, need a significant amount of space as well. So this picture here is the largest solar project in Virginia. It's 617 megawatts and is 6,350 acres in total. So one project, that project I sort of highlighted earlier, the Prince William Digital Gateway, is about a 5 gigawatt project. So that would be 50,000 acres for one data center. I believe someone mentioned earlier, there's about a 500 megawatt project in the Poconos. So that would be, about one to power that with solar power would be about one of these, equal. So as localities around Pennsylvania are considering bringing data centers into the fold, into their sort of economic development portfolio, here are the things that we recommend. First and foremost, a prohibition, or at least a great reduction in the utilization of non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs. We have advocated at the state level for more transparency around predicted and actual water use. And so those are two different things, right? So it is not uncommon, unfortunately, for data center developers to sign NDAs with water authorities, at least in Virginia. Those water contracts would include things like average daily, maximum daily, and like predicted annual. And so you kind of use that information to extrapolate, what's the peak use at certain times, what's average annual use, how does that ebb and flow with the weather. You can really utilize that information to get a fuller picture on how much water is actually being used. Same thing with energy use, same thing with site plan, same thing with who end user for the site is. Those types of things should be disclosed so the public has that information. Of course, as sort of the National Parks Protection Group, we have thoughts on siting restrictions and buffers from national parks. But of course, I think other community resources like schools, homes should also be taken into consideration. I think a half-mile buffer, sort of with understanding that, if there's an interstate on, kind of between the two, that we could probably sort of make some exceptions, but generally speaking, a half-mile buffer from resources that we're trying to protect is a good buffer. We should 100% be encouraging on brownfields and conversion of sort of existing industrial, abandoned shopping malls, that sort of stuff. Local government should be requiring noise modeling prior to, and then actual noise testing like 24/7 after the fact, with strict noise ordinances in place and enforced. The other thing that we've kind of touched on tonight is, how much of this is this going to go on forever, right? And so we encourage folks to really consider decommissioning bonds, cash up front to guarantee that if a project is abandoned at any point in the process, that there's money in place to return the site to its sort of its original form, or ideally even better. Um, you know, Tons of industries over the years have insisted that they will be there forever, and then vacant warehouses and vacant manufacturing plants sit there for decades. I think it's time. And, I don't think this is exclusive to data centers, to be clear. I think decommissioning bonds for industrial uses should be standard, but data centers are sort of the current boom and theoretical potential future bust cycle that we're seeing. The other thing I wanted to touch on are community benefit agreements, or CBAs. So a CBA is basically a legally binding agreement between community organizations, whether it's a homeowners association, a local nonprofit, or individual community members, or local governments, and sort of a developer or company. These are, as I said, legally binding, that outline commitments that should be followed and enforced. The nice thing about community benefit agreements is they can take sort of whatever shape that meets the community needs. That can be things like mitigation, new parks, stream restoration, tree plantings. I know that was discussed earlier, that those could all be built in. CBAs can require local hiring, job training for future workforce development, all of that stuff. Clean community energy. We've seen some examples of essentially developers offering to put solar on people's houses or something of that nature. So obviously the pros are actual and enforceable benefits to local community. Community members can become direct stakeholders in a project, and can, in theory, shift the power towards the community. Of course, the cons, some people get in on CBAs and some people don't, which has the ability to create winners and losers. So you'll have some people that get the solar on their house, and those just on the other side of sort of the street may not get it. And that is just, unfortunately, the reality. We're a pretty firm believer that the things listed on the prior slide should come first, right? So we can't do a CBA in lieu of the other things like transparency and proper siting. At the state level, as folks are considering sort of enacting state legislation, Todd mentioned some bills that are circulating in the Pennsylvania General Assembly, and I haven't been tracking those, so I'm not kind of sure where things stand. But this is what we recommend from our experience in Virginia. So Virginia did a data center study done by our Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission that was released at the end of 2024. That was too late. We were probably 3 to 4 years too late on that. So as Pennsylvania is thinking about this, get ahead of this. Do a study and make a plan. Figure out what actually makes sense. What are the sort of the boundaries that we want to put in place? Next, we strongly encourage every state whether it's the sort of Department of Environmental Quality level or the PUC, State Corporation Commission level, an examination of cumulative impacts, some level of state permit and oversight that would examine power source and delivery mechanism, water use, air quality, impacted communities, all the way down. Just provide an additional level of oversight of projects. These are projects that have impacts beyond the locality, and we should be treating them as such. We would strongly encourage things like a land preservation or mitigation tax to offset land lost. Virginia, we worked on a piece of legislation in Virginia that unfortunately failed this year, but would encourage others to look towards this model of, a dollar amount per square footage that gets funded, that funds new state park acquisition, new state or new public, just generally new public land, easements, access, outdoor recreation, outdoor education, that sort of stuff. State agencies should always be fully in the loop about water and energy use, and that information, of course, should be FOIAble and open to the public, but more importantly, state agencies should have it so that they're planning appropriately. And sort of as was mentioned earlier, protecting ratepayers from cost shifts, large load tariffs, actual versus contracted demand. So if, protecting against overbuild and that sort of stuff. So a couple of lessons learned in Virginia. I touched on some of these earlier, but do a study and have a plan. Make sure you know what you're getting into. A really good example of this. Virginia was the first state in the country to pass data center sales and use tax credit. It was predicted at the time to be about an $11 million per year loss to the state of Virginia. That is now $1.6 billion annually and growing. People did not know what was happening and what was coming. Virginia has been the guinea pig. So I would encourage Pennsylvania legislators, lawmakers, the general public to come into this eyes wide open. Set clear guidelines and standards early and enforce those standards, whether it's noise, whether it's energy efficiency standards. Make sure that there are mechanisms in place to enforce those. So a lot of things that we've seen just from a lesson in Virginia. Virginia's noise ordinances, if a data center is out of violation of that noise ordinance, Virginia code, because noise ordinance are civil fines that were written and drafted originally to prevent college parties from being too loud, carry very lenient fines, $250 to $500. It is demonstrably cheaper for data centers to simply write a check every time someone calls the police because they can't sleep at night than it is to upgrade their systems. So would encourage an actual enforceable measure, such as vacation of permit. Make them pay if there's actually violations of standards. Scale is everything. Virginia has 70 gigawatts. I think anybody would look at what has sort of happened in Virginia and go, that's a lot. That's probably too much. 1 to 2 data centers, if your grid system can handle it, probably not a bad idea. 2,000 of them, you start to have some problems. And then last but not least, coming back to that decommissioning bonds plan for what's next. A lot of the data centers that are being planned today are for artificial intelligence. Anybody that reads the economic news would understand that there are many questions about whether or not AI is going to meet sort of the need that people are actually live up to the hype. And so I think there's a very real chance that some of this proposed development does not come to fruition, and we need to be thinking about what's next for sites that have data centers on them or get planned for data centers, and maybe those don't come to fruition. So with that, I appreciate everybody's time. I will stop sharing and be to field any questions.
Okay. Kyle, great presentation. Thanks for your lessons learned from Virginia. As we look, there's infrastructure maps of the infrastructure of data centers. We can see that, Pennsylvania is right on the infrastructure for it. So we're next in line. We really appreciate the examples that you're bringing here and the advice that you're giving us. So I want to check with our panel. If our panelists could turn on the cameras, be ready to answer our moderated panel discussion. Are we okay going to like 8:45 for our panelists? Are you okay with that? We good? Okay, really appreciate your panelists. There's been, I'm looking at our questions, been over about 50 questions answered already by our panelists in the chat. So we thank you for that. We'll move into our time of moderated Q&A now. So we'll target to go for about a half an hour with this, and that'll take us to about 8:45. So I'll turn it over to Janet Anderson now with KADIC to start the moderated discussion.
Sorry, there we go. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to start with a question for Pete that we received. Pete, do data centers create demand for nearby businesses or additional housing? And what I mean by that is there an economic ripple effect that can be felt?
Yes, there is. Typically, a data center, for instance, being built in Cumberland County, requires additional technicians to service the equipment, requires providers that can sell specialized materials and things to the users of that data center. So that tends to spur development by some of the companies that support data center operations. So if they don't have a regional office in that locale, they create one. They hire, again, technicians, support workers, support staff to provide those services to that particular campus. So there is a ripple effect when data centers come into a new locale. Typically, in some cases, it may require additional housing, but more often than not, those resources are hired locally. Maybe a manager moves into that region who's experienced from somewhere else in the country, but then they hire a local staff. So in my experience, it does not tend to really have much of an impact on the housing, more on just the hiring.
Do any other panelists want to address that question? Okay. All right.
Okay.
Kyle, do you want to take-
Kyle, I will start with you on this one, Kyle, but I think it'll be general interest for most of our panelists. Do you believe Pennsylvania, where we love our local governments in Pennsylvania, we love our local control. We have 2,600 units of local government, each with their own zoning ordinance, comprehensive plan, subdivision regulations, each with their own board of supervisors or borough council. Do you believe, with your experience for Virginia, do we believe that we need some state preemption on the data center issue in Pennsylvania, meaning that we would set some statewide policies, statewide standards, and pull some of that local control up to the statewide level because of the hard press on data centers right now?
So I think the answer is it depends, right? Depends on the issue. So our position is that things that impact the state so there are certain things like buffers from schools, communities, and that sort of stuff. The state might want to offer guidances, zoning recommendations, but at the end of the day, that authority probably should remain with local governments. But things that impact broader statewide resources should probably have state oversight. And so as we're thinking about, new transmission lines that come through, right? So like a transmission line to power a data center that comes through 3 or 4 other localities should have some additional oversight by state regulators to examine those impacts beyond just a local government. And those things should be disclosed at sort of time of rezoning. So like a really good example of this for folks that are interested, Virginia just passed House Bill 153, Senate Bill 43 in Virginia this year, signed into law and will go into effect in July, where at time of rezoning, I guess this is only in county, so that's a good, yeah. In the locality, they'll have to disclose new electrical infrastructure needed to serve the project. I think that probably should have gone a step farther and just sort of disclosed that generally speaking. But I think as we're thinking about shared resources, our energy grid and water, the state should have some oversight.
Pete, how about you? Does it make your job easier if we have state oversight and state regulation?
Absolutely. I think generally for consistency's sake, having that statewide regulation is helpful, right? It helps the industry plan. But I agree with Kyle. There's a need. It's somewhat of a hybrid approach. I think that certain aspects require statewide oversight, but there are other aspects that local control is preferred. I think most jurisdictions would agree that they would like to have control over their communities rather than delegating that to the state. So, absolutely agree.
Patrick, Todd, you guys already kind of operate at a much broader level than each municipality. Any insight on the state preemption issue?
If I was still working for the state legislature, I might have a lot to say about preemption, but in my role at the Public Utility Commission, probably the less I say, the better.
Okay. Todd, anything for you, SRBC side?
Yeah, I don't think I really have anything at this point to talk about that. I mean, we have, I know there's some proposed legislation about reporting and things like that. I think that won't change our requirements. So, that, I guess that's all I have at this point.
Okay. Well, I'm going to move into some water issues. During drought conditions, Todd, this one's for you. Will data centers curtail water usage? What priority does it have over other uses? And if wells are being drilled, what safeguards protect existing wells?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in there. Certain drought declarations can have water use restrictions or requirements for reduction of water use. It really, some of that depends on their water source. If they have public water supply, there can be restrictions during certain drought declarations for that type of water use on a water system. If they're using wells, that process for groundwater withdrawals, I kind of mentioned in my presentation that there's a hydrogeologic evaluation. There's an assessment on whether that water quantity they're asking for from that well can be sustainably withdrawn through, what we consider a 1 in 10-year drought recurrence interval. So we're assessing potential for impacts to other users, and we do not allow a new withdrawal like that having impacts to other users, an adverse impact. We're not a zero impact agency, so that's where the balance is. But we would not allow a new withdrawal for a data center to have an impact that would interrupt that other existing water source.
Patrick, we'll throw an energy question over at you. So, we talk about energy usage, not having enough generation. A lot of times what we've heard from some of our residents too is blackouts or brownouts. So part one of the question, will the lights go off with the data center impact? And number two, if they do, whose lights go off first, the data center or our residents?
So, that's a complicated question, and I'll sort of break it apart in a little bit. So, one thing I would say at first, so, I mentioned PJM, they're the ones that are responsible for making sure there's enough generation across their whole system. There's some sort of nuances to that because some of their states are actually still vertically integrated, but that's basically the case. So, we have plenty of power right now. I'll also say that, they procure enough generation to have like a 20% margin. They procure about 20% more than they forecast they're going to need. So, there is some slack built into the system. That's sort of the good news. I will say though, like if you look at their load projections over the next few years, things are going to get tight. As I said, there's sort of a long lead time right now to get a lot of new generation resources on. There's a number of reasons for that, sort of supply chain issues. Some of them are issues at PJM. Some of them are issues with difficulty getting generation zoned. There's a lot of factors on why it takes a long time. But, getting new generation on the system can take, 3, 4, 5 years in some instances, and data centers can be constructed and start ramping up faster than that. So, I mean, there's going to be a point, I would say, in the next several years where, the amount of power on the system and the amount of demand are gonna get close. I certainly wouldn't want to be alarmist about it. I don't think that's warranted, but I also don't, I think it's something that people should, be considering. And I'll say that, PJM's considering, we're considering, our sort of fellow utility commissions in other states are considering it. As I mentioned, that right now PJM is running what they're calling their Connect and Manage Senior Task Force, which is basically trying to set out rules about, exactly where data centers should fall in the list of, what, to use the industry parlance, like this is called manual load shed, which is when PJM says, we don't have enough power on the system right now. And they go out to all the utilities that are in their grid and say, you have to cut, they give an amount, basically, how many megawatts each utility has to cut. And the utilities have plans that already exist for sort of the order of priority there. If there is a circuit on their system that has a hospital on it, you don't curtail that one, obviously. Also have agreements with some sort of, a manufacturing company that like they can shift production, so they can shut down a production line today and run it tomorrow. If they, there are already sort of some policies in place, but I think there's sort of broad agreement that those aren't sufficient right now, and that as sort of these data centers might be a big contributor to sort of the system getting really tight, that perhaps they should be bumped towards the top of the list in terms of who gets curtailed first. So I would say that's something that's still sort of policies in development, but obviously a major source of concern, something that a lot of people are looking at very, very closely. If a follow-up question, please feel free to ask. I don't want people to think of being like obfuscatory or anything like that. There's nothing's been sort of set in stone yet about exactly sort of what those policies are going to look like. I can say sort of from the policymaker perspective, my sense is that there's people want to make sure that data centers are not going to be still powered by the system if regular ratepayers are in the dark.
Anybody want to add on to that? Okay. All right, Pete, I've got another one for you. What is Cumberland County's largest constraint for new data centers? And if you could speak to, we talked a little bit about 4 different types of data centers. What's our sweet spot there? What can we expect? Is it the hyper center? Is it the co-locator? What should we be expecting?
Constraint standpoint, I think is probably this is a constraint really everywhere, and I don't think Cumberland County is any different. It is electrical capacity. What can the utility support? That's generally the biggest constraint really everywhere. And finding jurisdictions that do have capacity and utility that can support tends to be one of the first factors of whether development can occur in a certain jurisdiction. I think your second part was can we become like Northern Virginia? Was that where we were going? Apologies.
Yeah, or what is our sweet spot? Are we going to be the hyper? So I like both answers, but
good. So as far as is Cumberland County going in Pennsylvania as a whole going to become Virginia? Northern Virginia has a 20-ish year head start, and really the state Commonwealth of Virginia has a 20+ year head start. I would find it very unlikely that that Cumberland County would see the type of density that data center density like Northern Virginia does, and now becoming other parts of Virginia as well. The types of data centers, honestly, that would be harder to predict. Projects that I tend to work on are hyperscale cloud computing type of data centers. They're owned by one large user or operated by one large user. But if a colo type of company, or if there is a headquarters of, let's say, a large particular type of company there in the region that needs their own enterprise type of building and they want to build one, it's entirely possible that that could happen. It just depends on the individual needs of a large employer in that region. Edge data centers are a little bit unique in that they are typically used to serve a specific customer that is far away from a data center cluster, because it will increase their speed. Some of those are used in places I'll use a university that does a lot of research, or federal government has a lot of research institutions, whether it's medical research, Department of Energy, things like that. If they are not in close proximity to a data center cluster, then an edge data center is built there to help their services. It sort of helps speed their internet along, essentially. Honestly, any of these uses could be deployed in Cumberland County and in Pennsylvania as a whole, just depending on the needs of the customers in that region. So again, currently working on a cloud computing campus, but there's no reason why a colo company couldn't come in, or an enterprise company couldn't come in and ask for the same type of development.
Patrick or anyone else want to talk about either of those?
Yeah, I don't think I have any particular insight there. I will say, I guess I should mention, actually, now that I think about it, though, one of the things that we proposed in our that was in our sort of interim model tariff that will hopefully make it to the final version when that's promulgated, will be sort of a public queue, like a publicly available queue that will show like all the interconnection requests from data centers and sort of where they're located and stuff. So there might, people, if that goes forward, then there might be a source where people can, sort of look in their own local community and at least see sort of who's interested. But I don't think I have much more to add than that.
All right, I have a good one here for the group. So states like Maine have implemented moratoriums on data centers. When we look at Pennsylvania and everything that's happening here, and it's happening so quickly, do we need a moratorium in Pennsylvania? Yes or no? And then if you're saying yes, why? And if you're saying no, what are the impacts if we would have a moratorium on data centers and we'd see it, the construction would be severely limited or halted for a period of time?
Kirk, I'm going to take this one first and offer a mild correction. Maine's legislature passed a data center moratorium, but I believe Governor Mills vetoed the moratorium. I haven't seen if there's been an effort to overturn the veto, but as far as I know, that is not in place. And so I don't believe there's a moratorium in place in Maine or for that matter, anywhere. A couple of thoughts here. So NPCA is not in support of a moratorium, a blanket moratorium at least. I think, while we did not support this in Virginia this year, I think there could be a case made in Virginia. So there was a bill, House Bill 1515 in Virginia, that did not advance, but that essentially the premise was, as I pointed out, we have 70 gigawatts in the queue. The premise was basically to say, okay, no more until we clear that 70 gigawatts, and then we will lift it. I think a strong case could be made at that juncture. I think a case could be made for a temporary pause, whether you call it a moratorium or what. If the state wanted to, for instance, implement a study and then at the end of that study move forward, I think you could make a case for that. We haven't supported that, and I don't know if we would. But generally speaking, moratoriums probably aren't necessary. That's sort of like a hammer, taking a hammer to something that maybe doesn't necessarily. I'm screwing my analogy up there, but I think folks know what I'm trying to get at.
I'll jump in here. Probably not a surprise for somebody from the industry to not be necessarily in support of a moratorium. Certainly thoughtful discussions with legislatures and things, absolutely. But as Kyle noted, sort of a kind of a hard line to take, just to sort of blanket ban an entire industry. The way the data center industry operates is somewhat of a just-in-time principle. Data center operators forecast demand in the next couple of years. They tend to do it over a number of years. They have different forecasts, short-term and long-term. When there is what triggers a data center development to start is the forecast that the demand is increased in a certain area. And so right now, just in our economy in America, we are certainly moving away from paper and pencil into a digital economy, and data centers are what tend to power that digital economy. The demand is driving the expansion. I think all of a sudden in the last 6 months or a year, right, data centers are everywhere. Before this, I'm sure a lot of people on here never really paid much attention or paid much mind to a data center in general and what it does and what services it supports. But as we as an economy expand digitally, we host Zoom calls, we send emails, we go on Facebook, we bank, we stream movies, we play video games. That's what's driving the expansion. And if sort of a blanket moratorium to the industry, just as an example, Cumberland County enacts some kind of a moratorium and stops any projects. The industry will shift elsewhere. We'll just move to either another jurisdiction, local, or maybe another state. But the demand is necessary. In 3 years, an X amount of additional data center capacity is necessary, and so the industry will go try and find that a different location to be able to service that capacity. That has impacts, to jobs, that has impacts to tax revenue and things like that in different jurisdictions. But again, the industry, it reacts very fast. I think anybody who's been involved in any sort of any part of touching a data center realizes it goes much faster than a lot of typical business decision making does, because of that just-in-time mentality. And so, again, I would rather have thoughtful discussion in partnership and collaboration with the jurisdiction than kind of a blanket moratorium.
So, from where I sit, I don't think that I can weigh in on whether there should or should not be a moratorium in Pennsylvania. That's a decision for the General Assembly and for the governor to make. We're a regulatory body, not a policy making body in that sense. One thing I just will say, though, we're a part of the PJM grid, so irrespective of what Pennsylvania sort of decides to do, if data centers are just going to sort of locate right across the border in West Virginia or Ohio or something like that, a lot of the issues that these are causing on the electric system are still gonna, they're still gonna apply to Pennsylvania. It doesn't really matter where they're sited. If they're sort of anywhere on the PJM system, then you're going to see a lot of the same impacts. So it's not a direct answer to your question, but at least something I can provide.
Clearly, these are regional issues. They aren't just Cumberland County issues that we can put in a box. So moving on to a couple of questions that are related to the new technologies, Pete, that I think you mentioned that are coming online for cooling. I know some of the questions that were typed in were talking about when are those coming on, and also how long. You mentioned 10 to 15 years for the lifespan of equipment. Would that mean that new plants coming online now would wait 10 to 15 years to update those technologies?
I'll give you a yes and no answer, which is a terrible answer, I'll freely admit. In some cases, some data center operators may wait longer, right? They've spent money to invest in that initial technology. These new technologies are not cheap. They're just coming out of the ground in most instances, or still in sort of theoretical technology demonstrator mode. So in some instances, yes, absolutely. There's whether it's financially driven, resource driven, some operators would absolutely come in and replace existing systems or augment existing systems to try to reduce things like water usage. Some may not. I won't speak for the entire industry. But I'm pretty certain that some will and some won't. Not the answer you want to hear. A lot of factors, I can't necessarily predict the future, but I could absolutely see some operators jumping in and retrofitting, because long term it does save them money for reducing consumption of things like water.
Okay, I think we have time for about one more question. We'll make it a quick one, and just keep in mind it's for your responses. And this will be for everybody. So we'll kind of get down the row here. Each of you kind of give your response to this. So if we rewind the clock or fast forward the clock with regard to data centers, what would you suggest we do to improve the siting, development, impacts of data centers on Cumberland County?
Maybe I'll take a stab at that. I think if I rewind the clock, and I'd say most of my experience is in Virginia, so I'm going to use some of that experience to respond. But if I could rewind the clock in general for the data center industry, I think more thoughtful development in certain parts of the region I live and work in would have paid benefits further now that data centers are expanding into other regions, and I'll maybe expand upon that a bit. There are some instances where zoning allowed data centers in a certain jurisdiction in Northern Virginia, and a data center operator bought the land, rolled in and built a data center in a area that is primarily residential or sensitive. There's maybe little league baseball fields nearby, that sort of thing. While they were allowed to do it under the zoning rules that particular jurisdiction had in effect at the time, probably not the best idea. There was a bit of a, call it a land rush, perhaps, not the best decision making. And so a lot of times now when people look to some parts of Virginia as an example, is kind of having the world's greatest concentration of data centers, the few that are built in terrible locations around the area are used as a reason why the rest of the industry should never expand. Hey, Cumberland County, hey, any other jurisdiction, see what they do in Virginia. You don't want that here. And I think if I could have rewound the clock, and been able to offer jurisdictions better, suggestions for maybe changing the way they zone certain areas, even though it would negatively impact the expansion of the industry that I work in, it's more thoughtful, and it would be seen as being more of a partner and being more collaborative. And I think, and that's something that the industry as a whole is going to have a tough time, getting away from that, essentially.
Yeah, I'm happy to go here, and I'm going to jump in. I've got a 2 points. So first, I think Pete is right? Like, and I appreciate his honesty and openness about the industry has made some bad decisions in Virginia, and they're paying for that. I am here today because the industry decided that they were going to build the world's largest data center campus next to Manassas National Battlefield, and I had to fight them for 5 years to make that problem go away. That's what happens. You build an army of people who are opposed to you in your industry when you plan projects like that. So we'll start there. I think that obviously is the issue that we care about, but as Pete pointed out, there are other projects. Prince William County is a really good case study. Like data centers that are share a border with elementary schools. Probably not a good idea. You're probably going to piss off some parents when that's the plan. So I think that's a big part, like site selection and suitability. And then the other thing, I think it comes back to scale and just going into sort of something like this, eyes wide open. I think if Virginia, I believe I mentioned that Virginia, when they passed the data center sales and use tax credit, there was a prediction that it would be like $11 million a year, and it's now $1.6 billion a year. Nobody had any idea what was coming. And so I think going in, like if the state could go back in time, I think it would do things differently. I think it would have a better plan in place, a better structure in place. And quite frankly, Virginia, as I mentioned, is kind of the guinea pig on this issue and provides Pennsylvania and other states an opportunity to figure out how to get this right, how to have the compatibility where, let's be honest, Loudoun County has a great tax base from data centers because the industry pays taxes, and Loudoun County has nice schools and high teacher salaries because of this industry. So I think that there's an opportunity for states to look at Virginia and see what was done right and what was done wrong and do better.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to follow on to that. Just for example, we're working on a tariff for large loads now. I think Virginia, they had some sort of piecemeal parts of that, but they didn't really have a comprehensive one until I think maybe last year or something like that. I might be wrong about the exact date. We're at the early stages here in Pennsylvania because, we were able to learn from the experience in Virginia. So Kyle's certainly right about that point. In terms of, and I guess sort of expanding on that sort of thought from just, what could Cumberland County do differently to, I think, something that we could do differently statewide, and, something we need to sort of keep front of mind all the time. And I'll sort of borrow a story that, my boss, Chairman D. Frank, likes to relate, which is, he grew up in Uniontown in southwestern Pennsylvania. The coal industry there provided, a lot of good jobs and family sustaining jobs for a lot of people for a long time. But, there are streams there that are orange now. There, with any sort of big development boom or things like that, there are going to be sort of unforeseen consequences. I think it was Kyle who said during his presentation that, industries always say we'll be here forever and we'll clean up our own messes. That's not always the case. So, you sort of have to plan these things, plan for long-term consequences, even in the short term, even if you aren't sure that they're going to materialize. With where I sit specifically, that comes with requiring, really, really big deposits before we allow our utilities to start building infrastructure, because we do not want stranded assets here. We do not want to build power lines to nowhere that then regular ratepayers are going to have to pay for because the data center either does not materialize or decides to shut down earlier, or whatever the circumstances might be. We don't want to pay the cost to build new power plants that, again, are going to be, could be socialized across the entire network if they're not going to be necessary, because maybe we have, over forecast how much demand there's going to be 5 years down the line. So, I don't think it's, I don't think we have to wind the clock back too far, because I think we're still in it, and the decisions we're making now are still very, very important. And it's not too late to sort of resolve, or too late to resolve sort of anything here. But I think people need to be very smart about things.
Todd, how about on the waterfront? Looking back or looking ahead, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think, looking back, I wish we had maybe some more earlier conversations with data center developers. They kind of like came out of the blue, I think, and a lot of times there was a lot of preparations done kind of behind the scenes, work done behind the scenes, and really I hear a couple other panelists talk about careful, thoughtful siting, and there's a lot of benefits that would have occurred from some earlier conversations and gotten water in the discussions earlier. What we find often when we have a new industry that comes into our basin, it's water can be one of the last things they're thinking about. And I think people make a comment, Pennsylvania is rich in water, so they don't really think about it as hard. But it can really, if they think about it earlier, maybe consider some of those other cooling technologies to minimize their use of water. It really frees up more opportunities for development in certain areas where maybe they wouldn't think about, like maybe even like abandoned mine lands, things like that. So instead of approaching, farms and farmland and things that a lot of people in Pennsylvania, kind of hold dearly, maybe they could have, located in some of those other areas where people wouldn't be as concerned about it. But, really just, thinking about water earlier and having those conversations, thinking about alternatives.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Todd. That ends our moderated discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Janet now for some closing remarks here.
I'm going to be quick, I promise. So I'd first like to thank our panelists and the audience. On behalf of the Cumberland County Commissioners, the Cumberland County Planning Commission, and the Planning Department, Dickinson College, and Cumberland Area Economic Development Corporation, I want to close by expressing gratitude to our panelists tonight, Pete McGrath, Patrick Shaughnessy, Todd Eby, and Kyle Hart. You all brought depth, honesty, and real-world experience to the topic, and frankly, demands all three. And to everyone who joined us virtually tonight, whether you're a resident, a municipal official, a business owner, or simply a curious neighbor, Your presence here matters. The fact that we had to move this event from in-person to virtual because of the overwhelming level of interest tells you something important about Cumberland County. Cumberland County is paying attention. As an economic development professional, I've spent my career trying to help Pennsylvania grow in ways that are smart, sustainable, and beneficial to the people who live and work here. Data centers represent a new chapter in that work, one that comes with significant opportunity and legitimate questions that deserve serious answers. Tonight's conversation reinforced something I believe deeply. Economic development done well is not about chasing investment at any cost. It's about understanding what we're inviting in and setting clear expectations, making sure that growth serves our community rather than simply passing through it. Cumberland County has long been a place where quality of life, agricultural heritage, and economic vitality coexist. Our job is to make sure that any major new land use, data centers included, is evaluated with the full picture in mind. So what comes next? Here's what we want you to know about next steps. All questions submitted tonight, including those we are not able to answer during the moderated Q&A, will be compiled and answered in writing on our website at cumberlandcountypa.gov/data centers. Two bills have recently passed the Pennsylvania House of Representatives that are directly relevant to the topic. House Bill 2151, which would create a model data center ordinance through the Department of Community and Economic Development, and House Bill 2150, which would establish reporting requirements for energy and water usage. So we encourage you all to follow those bills and contact your legislators with your thoughts. Locally, several Cumberland County municipalities are already developing or have adopted data center zoning provisions, thanks to our Cumberland County Planning Commission, and they stand ready, the Planning Commission, to assist municipalities with navigating this process. Your voice matters. Everyone that listened in tonight should get engaged, attend municipal meetings, engage with the Planning Commission, and participate in public comment periods when land use changes are proposed in your community, whether it's for data centers or beyond. Tonight was never about telling you what to think about data centers. It was about making sure you have the information you need to think clearly and engage meaningfully. Economic development and community planning are most effective when they are rooted in transparency. I heard that word a couple of times. Informed by expertise and guided by the values of the people who call this county their home. That was what tonight was about. We're happy that you were here, and that is what we will continue to pursue. Thank you again to our panelists, co-hosts, and every one of you for joining us tonight. And I think we have the address for the recording coming up next. There you go. So you can find the recording if you want to go back and re-listen to it. Again, thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Good evening.